The courtroom went completely quiet when I walked in. My father let out a small, dry laugh. My mother just looked down like I was once again a disappointment to the family. The judge stopped what he was doing and just stared at the uniform I hadn't put on in years. His hand was shaking a bit when he said, "Good Lord, is that her?" Everyone else turned to look. No one spoke. It was the first time my parents ever seemed speechless because of me. This whole thing started 2 days ago. I was outside cutting back the wild bushes in my front yard when the mail arrived. One envelope stood out. It was thick, cream-colored paper with the county seal, one I knew from growing up. Hampton Family Court, Virginia. It wasn't a friendly letter. It was a summons. Case 7-A. Peterson versus Peterson. A petition for property division. I thought it had to be a mistake at first. Then I saw the names. Plaintiffs, Mark and Diane Peterson. Defendant, Sarah Peterson. My own parents were taking me to court. The words went fuzzy for a moment, and then I just laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the tired kind you let out when life throws something so ridiculous at you that crying isn't an option. I brought the letter inside and dropped it on the kitchen table. I just stared at it while my dog, an old shepherd mix named Buddy, came over and put his head on my leg. "Well, I guess they finally figured out a new way to get in touch," I said to him. It was the first contact in 12 years, ever since I left home. The last time they'd seen me, I was in combat gear, not my formal uniform. I had just passed the final, brutal phase of my training. My father didn't even bother to show up for the graduation. My mother just sent me a text that said, "We wanted a daughter, not someone who plays Army." After that, I gave up trying to make them understand. For years, I just did my job. I was in planning and support, getting teams where they needed to be. I wasn't the guy kicking down doors, but I made sure the supplies got through and the right people got out. I was proud of that work. Then, a roadside bomb near Kandahar hit our vehicle. I came back to the States with a leg that had more pins than bone, a permanent limp, and a medical pension. It was enough to live on, but civilian life felt empty and slow. I found a little house near the base, fixed it up, and did my best to move on, even though my parents never called, not even once. That night, after reading the summons again, I brewed some coffee and opened my old footlocker. It still smelled like diesel fuel and metal. My uniform was folded inside, looking almost new, the dark wool, shiny buttons, and silver pins. Beside it was the flag they'd given me at the funeral for my best friend, Ben. I hadn't touched the uniform since that day. My hands were shaking a little when I lifted the jacket out. Buddy just watched me, tilting his head. "Well," said to him, I guess it's time they find out who I am." The next day, I called. The courthouse. "That's right, ma'am," the person on the line said. "Your parents are filing to take ownership of the family property. They're claiming you abandoned it." I had to stop myself from laughing. Abandoned it? I was deployed. "Ma'am, you'll have to show up in person if you want to argue against it." I thanked her and hung up. Abandoned. That word cut deep. It was the same word my father used the night I told him I was enlisting. "You're abandoning us," he had yelled, his face red and angry, his hands stained with grease from the garage. "No, Dad," I'd said. "I'm just trying to do something important." He never forgave me for it. I drove past the old farmhouse later that day, or what was left of it. The paint was chipping off, the front porch was starting to sink, and the big maple tree in the yard was mostly dead. That house had been my grandfather's. He served in the Navy during World War II and built it himself when he returned from the Pacific. He used to tell me, "This house has stories, Sarah. You take care of it, and it'll take care of you." He left it to me in his will, and now my parents wanted to take it. I didn't feel angry right away. It was more like shock. Like the two people who were supposed to love me most had decided to just erase the last good thing that connected us. That night, with the crickets making a racket outside and Buddy snoring on the floor, I found an old letter I had saved. It was from my last commanding officer. "Officer Peterson, you served with honor and quiet professionalism. Remember that honor doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes it just means having the courage to be there." I read those words over and over. Then I went to my closet, got the uniform out again, and carefully wiped off the dust. The metals were dull in the dim light. I pinned each one on, remembering what they were for. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. The jacket was a little snugger than I remembered, but it felt right. It made me stand up straighter. For a second, I thought about just wearing a regular suit, but then I pictured walking in there, letting them all believe the story they'd told themselves, that I had failed and come home a broken person. No, not today. I combed my hair back, fixed my collar, and said to my reflection, let's just get this over with. Buddy barked when I picked up my keys. The sun was just coming up, bright and clear, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to see my family. By the time I got to Hampton, the summer air was already sticky and smelled like the nearby water. The drive from my little house took less than an hour, but my stomach felt twisted, like I was on a long flight into a war zone. I parked at the courthouse early and just sat in the car, listening to the engine cool down. I could see the old breakfast place where Dad used to take us after church. He'd drink black coffee and talk loudly about my brother Greg's football games. He never talked about my report cards, my scholarship, or the commendations I earned later. The courthouse looked old, its bricks were faded, and the flag was flying at half-mast for some reason. A custodian was sweeping the front steps. He gave me a polite nod, and his eyes lingered on the ribbons on my uniform. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. I just smiled and said, "Morning." The hallway inside smelled like cleaning supplies and old files. People were whispering on the benches. Lawyers walked by with stacks of paper. I sat down near the back, feeling people look at me. It wasn't mean, just curious. You don't see many women in a dress uniform in this town. When the clerk called out, "Case 77799A, Peterson versus Peterson," I stood up and took a deep breath. My bad knee always hurt, but my steps were even. All those years of marching drills stick with you. Seeing my parents again was harder than I thought it would be. My dad looked older, but just as hard. His hair was gray, but he had the same angry look. He was wearing his best suit, which always seemed one size too small. My mom sat next to him, wearing her pearls, sitting perfectly straight. Her eyes had the same look of disappointment I remembered from my entire childhood. She leaned over and said something to him when she saw me. I only heard one word: uniform. They both looked away. I sat down at the table across from them. I hadn't hired a lawyer. I didn't think I needed one. The judge, an older man named Harold Miller, came in. He looked at me, paused for a moment, and then cleared his throat. I thought I saw him recognize something, but then he started the hearing. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," he said, "you are claiming your daughter has abandoned her right to this property." My dad sat up straight. "Yes, sir, Your Honor. That house has just been rotting for years. We've been paying for the insurance and all the upkeep." That was a lie. I had been paying the property taxes by automatic withdrawal for years. The judge looked at me. "Officer Peterson, do you have anything to say?" My father blinked. "Officer?" The word just hung there in the quiet room. My mother's mouth opened slightly, and she looked confused. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. "I have some papers." I opened my folder. I had receipts, bank statements, and tax records, all with my name on them. "I've been paying for the upkeep of that property for over a decade," I said. "My parents haven't contributed to it since my grandfather died." My father pushed his chair forward, his face turning red. "You think you can just waltz in here with that costume on and make us look like fools?" "Mark," the judge said, his voice a clear warning. My mother put her hand on his arm. "Stop it." But he ignored her. He jabbed a finger in my direction. "You walked out on this family, Sarah. You went off to your war games while your mother and I had to hold everything down." I didn't let myself react. I'd heard it all before, when I signed up, when I re-enlisted, when I couldn't make it home for my brother's wedding. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice level, "I joined the service to do a job, not to walk out on you, but you both made it very clear I wasn't welcome." The judge shifted in his chair. "Let's stick to the facts." As the hearing continued, I mostly tuned out their complaints. They called me selfish, cold, and ungrateful. I'd learned a long time ago in the service how to filter out useless noise. What really hit me wasn't their anger, it was just how petty it all felt. I had watched friends lose everything and still find a reason to keep going because they believed in what they were doing. And here were my parents, fighting over a building that hadn't been a real home to any of us in decades. Then the judge did something I wasn't expecting. He asked, "Officer, if you don't mind my asking, are you the same Sarah Peterson who was honored by the Pentagon back in 2019? The one who managed that refugee crisis in West Africa?" My dad looked lost. "What crisis?" I just nodded once. "Yes, sir." The judge's tone changed. "I remember reading about that," he said, leaning forward. "That was an incredible piece of work, a real point of pride for this state." The room got very quiet. Even my father didn't have anything to say. My mother just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. When it was over, the judge didn't rule immediately. He said he would look at the documents and send his decision in writing, but I knew which way it was going. As I left, Dad muttered something I couldn't hear. Mom just sat there. In the hallway, people nodded at me. They were small, polite smiles, the kind you give someone you suddenly respect but don't know. I went outside into the bright sun and just breathed. The air smelled like car exhaust and the ocean. I thought about calling my brother Greg, but I knew he'd sided with my dad years ago. He always said, "You think you're better than us just because you're in the service." Maybe I did, or maybe I just learned not to waste my time on arguments I couldn't win. That night, I stopped at a small diner on the highway back to my house. The waitress filled my coffee cup and said, "Looks like you had a rough day." I gave her a small smile. "Something like that." She looked at my uniform. "Well, thank you for your service." It always felt weird when people said that. I never knew what to say back, so I just nodded. When I got home, Buddy barked and wagged his tail, his limp matching mine as he walked over. I sat on my porch and took off the uniform jacket, folding it carefully beside me. The stars were hard to see with the city lights, but I found the North Star. My grandfather used to show it to me when I was little. When you're lost, Sarah, find something that doesn't move. The sky, the ocean, or your own conscience. I realized then that I wasn't lost. I had just finally stopped trying to go back to a place I didn't belong. When I drove to the courthouse the next morning, I had a feeling they would be there. I could see them through the glass doors. My father was standing stiffly, his jaw set like he was ready for a fight he knew he couldn't win. My mother was next to him, holding her purse so tight her hands were white. I didn't look away. I'd spent years of my life dealing with men far more intimidating than him. Still, my hands felt clammy. It wasn't fear. It was that old, dull ache, the hope that maybe, just this once, my parents would actually see me for who I was. The courtroom seemed smaller. The benches creaked as people found their seats. There were whispers moving back and forth. The room smelled like old coffee and floor polish. The bailiff saw me come in wearing my uniform and nodded. "Officer," he said, his voice quiet and respectful. It still felt strange to be called that here. I sat at the defense table sitting up straight, more out of habit than anything else. When I put my cover on the table, the metal insignia made a sharp click against the wood. It sounded final. The clerk called our case again. "Peterson versus Peterson?" My dad cleared his throat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, this ought to be good," he muttered. Judge Miller came in looking the same as yesterday. His robe seemed heavy, and he had the tired expression of someone who has seen too many families tear each other apart. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "Officer Peterson, good morning." That title hit my parents hard. Dad shifted in his seat. "Officer?" he repeated like he couldn't believe it. I didn't say anything to him. I just nodded at the judge. The judge opened his folder. "We are here to resolve the ownership of the Peterson property, 47 acres on Maple Creek Road." My dad's lawyer, a guy from town in a cheap suit, stood up. "Your Honor, my clients insist that Miss Peterson abandoned—" "Officer," the judge cut in without looking up. The lawyer flinched. "Ah, yes, Officer Peterson. That she abandoned the property more than 10 years ago, leaving all the financial responsibility to her parents." The judge looked at me. "Your response, ma'am?" I opened the same folder I had yesterday, but I had added a few things. I had printed the records from the county tax office and a copy of my grandfather's will. "My grandfather left me that land, sir," I said in an even voice, "and for 12 years I have paid the taxes on it, every single year without fail." The lawyer leaned in. And what documentation do you have of that? I pushed the papers across the table. Every payment was a direct transfer from my military bank account. First from my active duty pay and now from my medical pension. The judge read the papers for a minute, his brow furrowed. This all seems to be in order. He looked at my parents. Mr. and Ms. Peterson, did you know your daughter was paying these taxes? My mother looked like she wanted to speak, but nothing came out. My dad answered for her, his voice sharp. If she was, she never told us. I looked right at him. You never asked. The words were quiet, but they landed hard. No one said anything for a long moment. Then Judge Miller took off his reading glasses. I don't normally bring this up in court, but I remember you now, officer. You were involved in that operation in 2019, the one near Yemen. Yes, sir. He nodded, looking thoughtful. That was an amazing job. My dad looked confused. What operation? The judge turned to him. Your daughter coordinated a team that evacuated 43 civilians from a flood zone during a conflict. She received a commendation for it. People in the courtroom started whispering. My dad's face went white. My mom's hand, which had been on his arm, dropped to her lap. I just kept looking at the judge. He leaned back, his voice calm but firm. This court finds zero evidence that Officer Peterson abandoned her property or her financial duties. In fact, this documentation proves she did the exact opposite. He tapped the folder. Petition denied. The sound of his gavel was loud in the quiet room. It felt like a door slamming shut on 20 years of arguments. My dad stood up so fast his chair almost fell over. You can't just... The bailiff moved toward him. Sir, my dad stopped. His shoulders dropped. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen him look small. My mom just stared straight ahead. I gathered my papers, trying to hide the fact that my hands were shaking. It wasn't because I was proud, it was just relief. The kind you feel when you've been holding something heavy for too long and you finally put it down. As I walked out, the judge spoke again, almost to himself. My God, he said, is that really her? He wasn't talking to the clerk. He was talking to the father who had missed my graduation, to the mother who had always looked at me with disappointment, and maybe to the part of me that had stopped believing they could ever change. Outside, the sun was bright. A few people nodded at me as I passed. An older man wearing a veteran's hat gave me a salute. I returned it. I got in my car and just sat there, finally letting out the breath I had been holding. Buddy was waiting for me at home, and for the first time it felt like I actually had a home to go to. Not just a house, but a life that was mine. I checked my rearview mirror before I drove off. I could see my parents through the courthouse doors. They were still just sitting there, not moving. Maybe they were trying to remember the daughter they knew, or maybe for the first time, they were finally seeing the woman I had become. That night, I didn't go straight home. I stopped at the old shipping docks where I had left for my first tour. The water was low and the boats were tied up tight. The air smelled like salt and fuel. I just sat in my car, still in my uniform, for a long time. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about everything it had cost to get to this point. People think being in the service makes you tough as nails, but they don't see the price. They don't know about the nights you wake up covered in sweat because a car backfired. They don't know about the letters you write to your parents that you end up throwing away because you know they won't understand. I remember on my second deployment, I got a package. It had some cookies and a little note that just said, "Stay safe." For a week, I thought it was from them. It turned out to be from a church group back home. That's when I stopped checking the mail. When I finally came home for good, I didn't make a big deal about it. Just me, my bag, and a knee that hurt every time it rained. I got a small apartment and tried to be a normal person. I fixed things. That's what I was good at. Motors, wiring, anything mechanical. My neighbors just thought I was a quiet vet. I was okay with that until I got an alert from my bank about a payment issue. That's when I remembered the farmhouse. The automatic payments from my military account had stopped when I was discharged, so I started paying them manually. I never told my parents. It wasn't about the house. It was about my grandfather. He was the only one who ever got it. He used to sit on that porch in the evenings, carving little figures out of wood with his old Navy hat hanging by the door. He'd tell me, "You've got your grandmother's eyes, Sarah. They're steady. They don't look away when things get hard." When I told him I was enlisting, he was the one who drove me to the bus station. Mom stayed home. Dad said I was throwing my life away. But Grandpa, he gave me a hug. "You come back in one piece," he whispered, "even if you're not the same." He passed away 2 years later. I was on the other side of the world. They buried him while I was gone. When I found out he'd left me the house, I cried for the first time in years. Not because I wanted the property, but because he was the only one in my family who ever really saw me. That farmhouse wasn't just wood and nails. It was the only proof I had that someone had believed in me. So when my parents tried to take it, it felt like they were trying to erase the one good part of my family history left. The night after the court case, I drove out there. The place looked even worse up close. The porch swing was gone and vines were growing all over the walls. I walked around with a flashlight, running my hand over the old wood. Under the railing, I found where he had carved his initials and mine right next to them. I smiled. He always said, "Names fade, but what you stand for doesn't." I sat on the steps and looked out at the dark field where I used to play. I could almost hear him humming an old song. I realized then that I hadn't gone to court for revenge. I had gone to protect the only thing that still mattered. The next morning, I went back to the courthouse, but not for a hearing. I just had to file one last paper. I gave it to the clerk, the nice woman who had been there yesterday. "What's this?" she asked. "It's proof that the property taxes are up to date," I said. "And a note for the public record. I'm not selling it." She nodded. "You're going to keep it?" "Yes, but not for myself." She looked curious. "Then who for?" I paused. "For anyone who remembers why it was built." As I was leaving, I saw my father in the parking lot. He was standing by his truck, smoking. When he saw me, his face tightened. "Congratulations," he said, his voice flat. "You made us look like fools in there." I took a breath. "Dad, I didn't come here to make you look bad. I came because it was the right thing to do." He scoffed. "Right. You think wearing that uniform makes you right?" I looked him in the eye. "No, but it reminds me who I am, even when you forget." He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked away, threw his cigarette on the ground, and mumbled, "Still so stubborn." I started to walk away, but then I heard him again, his voice a little softer. "You're just like him, you know. Your grandfather, too proud." For a second, I almost smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. When I got home, Buddy limped over and leaned against my leg. I sat on the couch and the exhaustion finally hit me. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. I looked at the uniform, folded on the chair. It wasn't about revenge. It was just a reminder of who I had become and who I wouldn't let them take away from me. The morning after the hearing, the sun cut sharp through my kitchen blinds, lighting up the dust floating above the table. My uniform still hung over a chair where I'd left it the night before. Creases sharp, metals glinting faintly in the light. For the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to do next. I poured myself some black coffee and watched Buddy limp toward his food bowl. The sound of his paws on the floor was steady, comforting. I'd trained myself to live by schedules, missions, orders. Now there was just silence. Around 9, I got a call from the courthouse. The clerk's voice was polite but nervous. "Officer Peterson, Judge Miller asked me to let you know that the written ruling has been filed. The property remains under your ownership." "Thank you," I said, "and thank him for his fairness." She hesitated before hanging up. "Ma'am, my own father was in the Navy. He used to talk about women like you. Said you were tougher than most men he ever met." I smiled softly. "Your father sounds like a smart man." When I hung up, I sat for a moment in that quiet kitchen and let it sink in. I'd won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the aftermath of a storm. everything still standing but rearranged. By noon, I drove back to town to pick up supplies: paint, sandpaper, a few planks of wood for the farmhouse. On the way out of the hardware store, I saw my father leaning against his truck. He didn't wave, he didn't move, just waited. "Guess we both had business in town, son," I said, keeping my voice calm. He exhaled smoke from a half-burned cigarette. "You made quite a show yesterday." "It wasn't a show," I said. He looked at me, squinting against the light. "You didn't have to wear that uniform." "I didn't wear it for you." The wind caught the brim of his hat, and for a second his expression softened, like he wanted to say something else, but the wall went back up. "You embarrassed your mother," he said finally. I shrugged. "I think she embarrassed herself." He stared at me for a long time, then flicked the cigarette into the dust. "I don't know who you are anymore," he muttered. "That's okay," I said. "I do." That evening, as I worked on repairing a broken fence behind the farmhouse, a pickup pulled up to the edge of the property. The headlights stayed on for a while before the engine cut off. Mom stepped out. She was still in her pearls, but her eyes looked tired, older. She held a small photo frame in her hand. "I found this in your grandfather's drawer," she said quietly, walking up the path. It was a faded black and white picture of him in his navy blues, grinning, one arm around a little girl in pigtails. Me. I took it from her slowly. "He always said I had his eyes." She nodded. "He was proud of you, even when the rest of us didn't understand." "Why didn't you?" I asked, not accusing, just curious. She looked down at her shoes. "Your father, he thought the military would change you, make you hard." "It did," I said. "But it also made me strong enough to forgive you." Her eyes lifted then, wet, trembling, unsure. We sat on the porch as the sky turned from gold to violet. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "He won't admit it, but your father watched that news clip about the rescue. Twice." I smiled faintly. "That's twice more than I thought." She reached out, brushing a bit of lint off my sleeve like she used to when I was little. "He doesn't know how to talk to you, Sarah. He only knows how to argue." "Yeah," I said softly. "I noticed." Before she left, she turned back. "You should come by Sunday. Dinner's at 6. Your father might actually be home." It was the closest thing to an olive branch I'd ever been offered. "I'll think about it," I said. After she drove away, I walked around the house, touching the walls, the beams, the door frames. Every nail my grandfather had driven felt like part of him still lived there. When I stopped by the front porch, I noticed something carved faintly under the rail. Strength without anger. It wasn't my handwriting. It had to be his. And it hit me then. Maybe the real revenge wasn't the silence in that courtroom or the shock on my parents' faces. Maybe it was standing there now, calm and unbroken, still choosing decency after everything. I spent the next few days restoring the house. I painted the porch, cleared the weeds, repaired the swing. I didn't call anyone for help. I didn't need to. Every nail I drove into the wood felt like forgiveness made tangible. At night, when I'd finished, I'd sit on the steps with Buddy beside me and watch the fireflies. The world was still full of noise, news, anger, division. But out here, it was just crickets, water, and wind through the cornfields. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you earn. On Friday, as I was cleaning up, I saw a truck pull into the drive again. This time, it was Dad. He didn't get out right away, just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, engine running. Finally, he stepped out, walked halfway up the path, and stopped. "You fixed the swing," he said. "Yeah," I said. "Grandpa would have wanted it done right." He looked around the property, the field, the barn, the fresh paint. Then he nodded once. "You did good," he said. No smile, no hug. Just that. It was more than I'd ever gotten before. He turned to leave, but then paused. "See you Sunday, maybe?" I said. He gave a small grunt. "Don't be late." As he drove away, I sat down on the swing, the boards creaking beneath me. And for the first time since I was a child, I felt like home didn't hurt anymore. Sunday arrived faster than I thought. The morning was damp and overcast, with a light rain fogging up the windows. Buddy followed me around the house, his claws tapping on the wood floor, as if he was confused about why I was getting ready to leave. My uniform was still on the chair, not the formal one this time, just the simple daily service uniform, clean and pressed. I wasn't trying to prove a point this time, I just wanted to show up as me. The drive to my parents' house was silent. I had the radio on low, some country song about families and time. The fields looked wet and brown. It had been 12 years since I'd been there for a meal. 12 years of missed holidays, ignored phone calls, and news that I only heard from other people. When I pulled into their driveway, the old garage was still standing, the paint peeling. My dad's tools were hung up inside in perfect rows, like he was trying to keep one part of his life in order. I parked next to his truck and sat there for a minute before getting out and knocking. My mother opened the door. She was drying her hands on an apron. "You're here," she said, her voice sounding a little surprised. "You said dinner was at 6, I replied, checking my watch. "Didn't want to be late." She almost smiled. "Your father's in the backyard. Just go on through." The house smelled like roast beef and potatoes. It was a smell that almost made me forget how much tension used to fill that kitchen. I went out the back door and saw my dad on the steps, cleaning an old hunting rifle. It was broken down, just pieces he was carefully wiping with an oiled rag. He was always fixing things, as if keeping his hands busy kept his mind quiet. He didn't look at me when I walked up. "Figured you wouldn't come." "I almost didn't," I said, being honest. He nodded, still rubbing the cloth on the metal. "Your mother thought you might." We just sat there for a bit. The rain was tapping on the roof above us, a quiet, steady sound. Then he said, still not looking at me, "So you kept the house?" I did. "You gonna move in?" "Maybe. I have to fix it up first. Grandpa built it solid. It just needs work." He nodded again, his hands stopping for a second. "He would have liked that, knowing you were taking care of it." "I think so," I said. He always taught me to see things through." My dad put the rifle parts down and finally looked right at me. "You think I was wrong," he said. It wasn't a question. I took a breath. "I think you were afraid. You wanted a daughter who would stay home. You got one who left." His jaw got tight. "You almost got yourself killed out there." "I know, but I also helped save some people." He leaned back against the post and he suddenly looked older. I guess I never looked at it that way. "You didn't want to," I said, but I kept my voice gentle. We were quiet for a long time. The rain started to let up. The air smelled like wet dirt. Finally, he just let out a long sigh. "You know, when that judge called you Officer Peterson, I didn't even know who he was talking about. I didn't recognize you." I nodded. "I barely recognized you either." He huffed out a small laugh. "Fair enough." We went inside. Mom had set the table the same way she always did, mashed potatoes on the left, gravy in the old blue bowl. She poured us iced tea, then sat down next to Dad. For a minute, it almost felt like a normal family. They asked me questions, but not about the service or the medals. They asked about my life. "How's the leg?" "It still aches when it rains." "You living all alone out there?" "Just me and Buddy." When I mentioned the dog, Mom smiled. "You always were bringing home the broken ones." I smiled back. "Guess I am one." Dad looked down at his plate. "You're not broken," he said, his voice low. "You're just different now." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm still yours." He swallowed hard and his eyes looked a little wet. "I didn't think I'd ever hear you say that again." After dinner, we all stood on the porch and watched a storm gathering in the distance. Dad said, "You remember that night before you left for basic training? I told you not to go." I remember. I was wrong. The words were simple, but they meant everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was my grandfather's old compass. "He left this for me," Dad said. "But I think he would have wanted you to have it." I opened it, the needle still pointed north. Inside the cover, he had scratched some words. "Honor is the only direction that never changes." I had to blink a few times to keep my voice clear. "Thank you, Dad." He nodded, and then he put his hand on my shoulder. It was awkward, but it was real. When I left that night, they left the porch light on. I looked back in my mirror as I drove away. They were both standing in the doorway, side by side. For the first time, I didn't need them to wave. Back at my place, I put the compass on the table next to my folded uniform. Buddy curled up at my feet. The world was quiet. Sometimes healing doesn't happen with big speeches. Sometimes it's just a porch light left on. That night, I knew the fight between us was finally over. A few months later, the air was cold again. Autumn in Virginia. The farmhouse was almost done. The porch was painted, the swing was fixed, and the old flag my grandfather had saved was flying by the door. I had replaced the windows, cleared the land, and fixed the leaky roof. Every repair felt like I was fixing more than just a house. Buddy was still with me, his fur getting gray, limping along as I worked. "Almost there, boy, but come," I told him. When the sun went down, I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the trees turn orange. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt right. A few cars pulled up the driveway that night. My parents got out, and then my brother, Greg, and his wife. They were holding a big dish covered in foil. "Didn't know we were having a party," I said, standing up. Dad shrugged. "Your mother wanted to see the place." Figured she was right. Mom smiled. "It smells like new paint. Your grandfather would have liked that." Greg looked around, hands in his pockets. "You did all this by yourself?" "Pretty much," I said. Took a while." He nodded. "Looks good, Sarah. It really looks good." For a family that only ever knew how to criticize, it was a big deal. We ate on the porch. The food was simple, and the conversation was a little hesitant, but it was real. At one point, Dad raised his glass of tea. "To the Petersons," he said, "and to the one who finally made us proud." I looked at him, surprised. Then I raised my glass. "To the ones who taught me what pride really means." Mom's eyes looked watery, but she was smiling. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. After they drove off, I stayed on the porch, watching their taillights vanish. I thought about all the years I'd spent being quiet, trying to prove I was good enough, thinking that being proud was the same as being at peace. I used to think being right was what mattered. Now I knew it was more important to be honest and to be kind when you finally got the chance. The next morning, I drove to the local high school. They had asked me to come and talk for Veterans Week. The principal introduced me. "This is Officer Sarah Peterson," she said. "She served in the Navy, and she's one of our own." The whole gym full of kids got quiet. I walked up to the microphone feeling the same way I did in the courtroom, calm. "I used to think honor was about the medals you win," I started. "But then I learned it's about the choices you make when you think no one is looking." I told them about my grandfather, about fixing the house, and about forgiveness. I didn't tell them about the court case or the anger. They didn't need to hear about the fight. They needed to hear that being strong and being angry aren't the same thing, and that being quiet can be its own kind of strength. When I was done, the students stood up and clapped. That night, I drove back to the farmhouse. The sky was full of stars. I sat on the porch and took out my grandfather's compass. The needle pointed north. Under his words, I'd added my own. "Forgiveness is the truest discipline." Buddy put his head on my leg and sighed. The flag made a soft sound in the wind. I thought about that day in court, my father's laugh, my mother's shock, the judge's quiet voice. I wouldn't change any of it. They needed to see the uniform, not because I wanted revenge, but because it was the truth. It was the proof of the life I had lived while they weren't looking. And I needed to remember that dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you hold onto. As the porch light shined against the dark, I whispered, "Grandpa, I think you'd be happy." The wind rustled the leaves, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel angry. I just felt grateful for the pain and the distance, because they taught me how to be strong enough to finally come home. If you're reading this and you feel like no one understands you, or if your own family has pushed you away, don't try to prove them wrong. Just keep doing what's right. And when the time comes to face them again, do it with kindness instead of anger. That's what real honor is.